Welcome to today's discussion of how to render a floor plan using Adobe Illustrator. If you remember from the last video on how to render an interior elevation drawn in AutoCAD using Adobe Illustrator, you'll probably remember that they're both programs. They work well together because they're both vector drawing programs. And we're going to use the same, very similar techniques with our floor plan that we did with the elevation. But one big thing that's different here is plans have kind of a few more elements that make them a little more complicated than an interior elevation. So when you do your right block exercise, where you export the plan out of your model, it's probably best to export several versions, and those will come in as layers on in Illustrator. For example, I like to have a clean plan. I turn off things like dimensions and flooring and furniture and get just a nice clean plan that I can W block. And like we did before, you select your object. And you see how I'm not getting any of the other stuff, although there's one little random fellow there. I can see in my little preview here, there's no hatching, no text, nothing like that. So I would recommend creating a block for a clean kind of floor plan, also one that has the furniture in it, a different one that has like the flooring and maybe any poche in it, and then I'll show you what happens when you import dimensions into Illustrator. So just like we did last time, let's take a look at a couple of examples. Again, I've left these up, the web page up, so you can see where these images come from. People can get their credit. There are a couple of different styles that you're going to see, but basically similar elements to the elevations. You're gonna want to somehow represent the kind of architectural volume here, the building, stairs, those things that may have graphic life, like swings on the doors, but don't exist in reality. You're going to want to represent materials, and then sometimes it's really nice to give a little vague sense of lighting just for depth. Here they're showing a little bit of brightness by the windows for shadowing, but also shadows behind objects, things like drop shadows are awfully nice. Here's a more dramatic example and a very different kind of poche color here. And then finally, here's an example where they've used white poche. So a couple of different examples. So here we are in good old Illustrator, and I'm going to place the floor plan into this drawing. And I made the drawing about the right size, I think, for this particular floor plan. And as you can see here, when I go to place this, I have a couple of drawings that I've created for the floor plan. One's just the walls. One has hatches, one has furniture, and one has the annotation. Like before, I'm going to show my import options, and I'll place the drawing and set it to 1/4 inch scale, which, if you remember correctly, is a scale of 48:1. Just click OK, place my plan, and you can see that it came in nice and cleanly. And like we did with the elevation, we can pretty quickly set the stroke characteristics. I'm not going to change the line weight, just I'll make it black and white. And one thing I like to do with plans, I think with the elevations, so let me go to my favorite effect, the roughen effect here under the distort and transform grouping. I've messed around with this a bit. What I like is to have it kind of have a little bit of a, squiggliness to it. It's probably a little bit too much. Maybe if I go with 0.1%. Yeah, that's about right. That gives me just a little bit of kind of scruffiness to the line work. All right. And that's basically all I need to do for the floor plan. I could come in and check and make sure that these are dashed lines and things like that, but this gets me a good start. So next I'm going to place the hatching here on the plan, but a good policy is to create a new layer. And I could bring in that group, poche, and it'll come in as a group, but it's just easier to create a whole new layer. And in fact, I can even label it, here I'll label it hatching. It just makes it simpler when you want to change the overlaps, which objects are on top of other objects. For example, if I drag it below the layer with the line work, I know that any hatching will show up underneath those lines, which looks a little cleaner. Anyway, let me place my hatches here, and same as before, set our scale. And I do get that warning message about swatches, which is typical of an AutoCAD drawing. So here is my drawing with the poche, and I can use my select command to move the objects into position. And you can see that you basically get a little bit of a snap to the objects that are there already. I guess I haven't drawn any flooring underneath the cabinetry. But you can see that the poche and the other elements have come in pretty nicely. The first thing that I can do here is I can try to change the color of the poche. And there's a couple ways you can select it, but what I find the easiest way to do is actually just to go through the layers palette and find the poche. And there really are only a few hatches in this drawing. I can kind of turn them on and off and see which ones are which. And to select it, I can just click on the bullet here, and it selects the color. And then it's pretty easy to choose, say, a different color and even a different opacity, if you're so inclined. And if I wanted to add things like my transparency mask that I added before, I could come in and do that here in my transparency palette, but I think it's good the way it is. Now that is what I like to do with poche. When it comes to the other hatches, let's see, I believe this is the hatch here. Yeah, that's right. I like to do an effect that uses a different brush style. This is actually one of the default brushes here, this whatever it is, a mop-shaped brush. What I like about that is, I don't know, it gives it kind of a hand-drawn look to it. Here, I'll make that a little smaller. And it just has a nice kind of artistic effect. In fact, I can even do my favorite effect on the hand-drawn look if I give it just an ever so slight roughness to it. Let's see, let's try this. By the way, if you do click preview here, this can take quite a while, so I'll warn you ahead of time. That might be a little too squiggly. Let's go back to 0.1 and see what we get. Well, that's not really much at all now, is it? That looks about right. So you can see that it kind of gives it just an ever so slightly hand-drawn look to it. And by the way, you can see here, let me turn off the other layers. Whoops, not that one. Turn off the line work here and the other hatch. You can see that there's an outline here. You can delete that just by selecting it using the direct selection tool. So I'll just hit the delete button and away it goes. So that's a nice look for the main room. And again, I'm not trying to represent true materials here. You can absolutely do that using the images that we used in the interior elevations. And that works great. I'm just going to go with these minor effects here. I prefer that a lot of times in the floor plan. Otherwise, it gets a little complicated. Also, you already saw how to do that in the previous video. So with these this flooring pattern, again, you know, it's a matter of aesthetic taste. I can try my go-to color here. I can make it a much narrower line weight and make the stroke color perhaps just a little light gray. And again, that'll give me a nice effect. Okay. Oh, and I still have my border, which I want to delete. There we go. So that's a pretty clean pattern. Any changes to this pattern, by the way, if you want to change the centering, for example, I just noticed that it's really not a good position here. You'd have to the easiest way would be to go back to AutoCAD and change it there. So that's changing the poche layer. Let's go and try another element of our project, which is the furniture. And once again, let me close this up here. I'm going to make a new layer, and I'll call it furniture. Furniture, okay. And then I'll import or place my furniture W block here in the project. And once again, set the scale. Gets a little repetitive, and allow all the swatches to be merged. Okay, I'll place this object. Now, what I like to do with these W-blocked furniture elements is I like to actually explode the block or ungroup the group here. I can do that by right-clicking on it and choosing Ungroup from the context menu. And the reason is that components, or I'm sorry, blocks from AutoCAD, they come in separately, and often I like to kind of tweak the way that the, say, drop shadow and the color is. It's much easier when you've ungrouped these guys and made them into separate elements. You can see here, here's the name of this block. It actually, all blocks come in with the name insert. I don't know why, but it does. Anyway, so I can select that block, and I'm going to just turn off the hatching for a moment to make things a little clearer. And now you can see I can edit this block. I can, as I've done before, change the stroke, change the line weight. And the other thing that I can do, I can paint it, maybe I'll paint it a kind of moderate gray, using the Live Paint Bucket tool. Like we saw in the last exercise, it will have to convert this to a live paint group in order for it to work. But now I can come in and these all will be painted, and they'll all be part of one group, which makes it easy to control the kind of layering and overlaps. Now, the last thing I like to do, and again, this is totally a matter of kind of aesthetic preference, I like to add a little bit of a drop shadow onto this guy. And what I like about that, I feel like it gives it a little bit of depth, which otherwise you wouldn't really have. Floor plans are a little flat. So, and each object you're going to have to kind of look at what it looks like, I guess is the best way to put it, and decide how you like your drop shadow to go. And again, I have mentioned that this is really an aesthetic decision, so you'll just have to kind of think, what do you look like? What do you like? How do you like the way it looks? So there we go. There's my table with a drop shadow. Now I can also come in and edit this countertop here, which I've drawn as a series of lines. Now the problem is I want the countertop to have a little bit of a fill pattern on it, but I can't fill this pattern when it's just three individual lines. So what I need to do is convert these lines to a path. And paths can then be filled. So the way you do that, you select the objects, and you go to the path option under the object menu, and choose Join, or Command J. And now they are one object. I'll just click off of it and click on it. You see that the object is all one. And I can change the stroke to be whatever I want. I could even change it to be a different brush. But the best part is if I double click on it, now when I draw additional lines, it should create a filled path based on, well, whatever fill that I have assigned, which I guess I haven't assigned it a fill pattern here. Oops, I guess we need to select this first. And again, you can choose a color that you think works for your project. Here we go, green. It's awesome. And like with other colors, you can change its opacity. There are, by the way, a lot of advanced resources for colors here under the color menu, all sorts of guides and swatches and that sort of thing. For our purposes right here, I'm not going to get into hues and tints and adding white or adding gray or adding black. That is kind of an advanced discussion. Anyway, for us, for our purposes, this works pretty well. So finally, I can add a drop shadow to this guy if I want, and of course the drop shadow might want to be vaguely representative of what how high the object is. So maybe you modify these to be a little bit bigger or a little bit less, depending on what kind of object you think you're going to have here. And again, you can change the blur like we did before. Maybe I'll make this a little less blurry, just to give myself a little bit sharper shadow. So there you go. I can go turn on my layers here once I exit isolation mode. And there we go. Turn back on my hatching, and you can see that we are starting to get some pretty interesting arrangements here. So that is the basic elements of the floor plan. You can see that it's starting to come together. If there are additional objects that you want to add, for example, if I'm here and I'm fiddling around with the hatching and, I really want to have, I don't know, a solid color to represent the threshold, I would recommend putting those objects, whatever they are, putting those on the layer that is kind of representative of that's purpose. Like this is going to be a hatched element here. Let's make it recognizably brown, and maybe a tad less opaque. Be sure that you put it on on the correct layering group, and that way you can control kind of the sorting of these different layers on top of each other. All right, doesn't always work, but it is nice because you can control the visibility all at once. All right, I'm not going to do every little piece. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is bringing in text from AutoCAD, and I'm going to make a new layer for myself for the text. And again, you can control the layer order for visibility, and then you just place the text drawing. I think I called it annotation, actually, which is a fancy word for text and dimensions. And what you'll see, I'll just bring this guy in, is that the text actually does come in pretty cleanly. I'm just going to make it black so that it's easy to read. However, what I'll show you here is that there is a small problem. The text is in fact text, so if I double click on it here and I use my text tool, I can come and add words, and the object is editable. The same with the dimensions. You have the tick marks and the text. The only problem is, let's zoom in on this a little bit. What you'll see is that it's actually a funny kind of text. It's a filled text, and I don't actually quite know how to change that. And some things are not even very easily editable because the text is coming in as different pieces. So what I would recommend is the line work is probably fine to bring from AutoCAD for dimensions. That'll save you some time. But for the text and also for the arrows, I would definitely create those in Illustrator. And I'll show you why. This arrow here, if you look at it, it's actually made up of like a whole bunch of little pieces of objects. So much better is to put in some text here in right here in Illustrator. And the way you do that, click the Type tool, draw yourself a text box, choose a font, and choose a font here. I'll click on the drop-down list. There's the millions of fonts that are available in kind of the Adobe world. Some of those fonts have some features, and then choose a size which makes sense for wherever it's going in your drawing, and then you can type away. And it has the usual editing tools. You can select it and change the font and whatnot. And these are objects that can be moved around, and there are a lot of fancy features that you can do with text. So now that we've got the text in place, we can draw a leader line, and it's pretty straightforward. Just use the pen tool. I would not click and drag. I would just click with the pen tool to start drawing, and that'll draw you a nice straight line, and then you can point right at the fireplace. Now, of course, this is an object. I don't really want any fill in my arrow. I want it to just be a black line. There we go. Maybe a little darker. Okay. Now, to add an arrow to this object, it's really actually quite straightforward. You just come over here to the strokes palette, and And there you have a lot more control than kind of up on the control bar. And you can make some of the same changes about the line weight. But then you can come over here and add an arrowhead, and there are quite a few kind of basic ones that come with Illustrator. Let's just choose one of these. Oh, and it seems to want to be on the other side. Here we go. You can add them and take them off as needed. And you can see here that that looks pretty nice. And once you've kind of set that, any additional lines that you draw usually have the same arrowhead on them. You can see how as I draw the, if I end the line right now by hitting escape, it would put the arrowhead there, but then as I keep clicking, it keeps adding it. So I can have multiple notes here, and I can even copy my fireplace text and type in additional notes. Okay, so that is doing text in Illustrator. So the last part of what I'd like to do to kind of gussy up my drawing here is I'd like to add a little bit of a drop shadow to this model here, or to this drawing. I find that a little bit of drop shadow on the outer walls is really nice to give you just a greater sense of depth, as if you've sawn off the plan here. This is a little tricky, and what I like to do, again, I've mentioned many times that I like to have multiple layers here, and I'm going to make a new layer, and here I'll even label it drop shadow, so that I can keep track of what I'm doing. And it's usually a good idea for that shadow to go underneath the plan layer, okay? And the reason is that the plan layer wants to kind of block out any kind of spill from the shadow. Anyway, the drop shadow, the way you draw it is basically the same as the way we kind of drew the cones of light in our interior elevation example, which is basically we want to choose a swatch for the fill pattern that is going to have a kind of faded gradient. Okay, and lo and behold, if you go to the swatches library, there is indeed a whole section for gradients, and there is one called fades. And if you look here, there are a number of different ones we have used for the brightness. We've added fade to white. In this case, we're going to use fade to black. And there are some that are darker and some that are lighter and some that produce all sorts of different effects. I'm going to use this one here, and you can see when I double click on it, it becomes the active fill pattern, and I don't even need a stroke pattern, although I think I'll draw one in at first just to make it easy to see what we're doing. And I'll start by kind of drawing off the edge here. Just gives me a little more freedom. I often don't like it when it's snapping a little bit too much to different objects. Anyway, and then I'll see how it just desperately wants to snap to those objects. So here is my shading pattern, and I can just move it into place. Let me just close this out of the way. And if I want, I can go and use the direct selection tool, and that allows me to grab these individual anchor points and drag them down into position. Okay, and of course you can change the how deeply the shadow extends. One trick that I like to use, just get rid of the line weight here. First of all, like we did with the light cones, I like to add that blur effect to the shadow. The Gaussian blur is the one that I like the best. And again, you just do a little preview here and check and see if you like the way it softens it. And I find it just, I don't know, makes it a little more shadowy. Which is really actually not a technical term, but anyway. So what I can do here, I can select this object, and if I want to say have the shadow come from, look like it's the window is creating a shadow, which is going to be a little shorter than the other one, I can make a copy of this guy and I come in with my direct selection tool, and I can shorten it way down so that it is the right width for the window, but then I can also make it a lot less deep in terms of the shadow that it actually creates. And then this is an object that I can come in here. And again, it's very important to try to get things as accurately as possible. There's only so precise you're going to be in this particular instance, but you can get a pretty good approximation of the window being a different height, even without actually having it be an exact height. And by copying the one that I already created, the shadow that I already created, it already has a bunch of the properties that I like, for example, the blur. And that is a way that you can create quite a bit of depth in your floor plan. You can see how it's a much deeper shadow than you get under the furniture or under casework. And I find that just is, it just adds something to it. We could also, by the way, add that same lighting effect if we knew where the lights were in this particular project. So that's my floor plan. By the way, I would continue the drop shadow all the way around. I usually do a shadow cast off to the right and at the bottom. Now, if you think of north being the kind of default orientation for a plan, that actually doesn't make sense because it would have to be sort of, I don't know, very late in the evening on a summer evening to get a shadow in that direction in the northern hemisphere. But anyway, that was the shadow angle that I have gotten used to. So the last part of drawing floor plans that I thought I'd show you here is that sometimes it's necessary to draw what are called diagrams. And diagrams are awfully useful for, say, indicating circulation. And you can do that right here in this file and kind of use parts of this to draw the diagram. What I like to do is create a new artboard. And an artboard is basically a blank sheet of paper. I'm going to make a new artboard here, zoom out a little bit. And these artboards can be any size. They don't need to be the same size. In fact, there's a whole artboard tool where you can modify the size of these, and you can move them around and stuff. So you can kind of have like a bunch of sheets of paper laying on your tabletop, so to speak. And in fact, when you create a PDF of this file, it will be a multi-page PDF with each of these documents. Anyway, I'm going to take my plan and maybe I'll make a copy of it, and I'm going to transform that guy, scale it down to, let's see, no, I don't want it bigger. I think I want it smaller. And this would be 1/16 of an inch equals a foot. And this is a way that I can create a diagram for circulation. Typically, those are smaller. And now all I have to do is draw some kind of line. This time I think I'll use the pencil tool, which I'm not sure I've used yet in these demonstrations, and give it a line color, stroke color that is nice and bright and maybe a little bit thick. And I'll just use the regular basic brush here. But now when I draw with the pencil tool, by the way, you click and drag and it will continue drawing a nice smooth line. This is opposed to the pen tool, which wants to draw line segments or Bezier segments. And here I'll draw circulation that takes us right into the main room here. There's a nice big red loop. And maybe I'll see if I can add an arrow at the end of it. Oh, it always goes on the other side. I don't know why. I must be drawing left-handed or something. Everything always shows up on the wrong side. So there you go. That might be some start of a diagram. Again, these are vector objects, so if you need to modify them in any way, you can come back in and sort of gussy up your diagram. Anyway, what I probably would do is I would probably crop this artboard so that it's a little bit smaller, because that's the only diagram I'm going to have on there. But you can see if I wanted to use any of these other elements, I don't know, create a furniture diagram or something like that, you could pretty quickly create those diagrams just by kind of copying assets from one view to the other. All right, the other thing I was going to show you here is a kind of bonus part of this lecture, which is, as long as we are in Illustrator, it is possible to do board layout. So I can create this drawing and I can send it to some other program like Adobe InDesign or Photoshop if I wanted to apply some special Photoshop types of effects. But I could also just do a board layout right here in Illustrator. And one of the nice things about creating a board, this is like a 36-inch wide, 24-inch high art board, is that you can use a lot of the tools, the drawing tools that Illustrator have, which are actually, not only are they very powerful, they're a lot of fun. For instance, here I've drawn a rectangle. It's just a box. But if I come in here and look at my brushes and go to my brushes library, what you'll see, right here on the borders grouping, there are a bunch of different ones. Let me start with decorative here. And, oh yeah, look at these. These are nice. All you have to do is select the rectangle that you want to modify and then click on the type, and it will add it to your stroke. And of course, it's a stroke, so you can change its size just by using the drop-down list, or you can type in a number if you want something bigger. Also, there are a number of text tools that are really valuable. For example, if I come in, let's say with the pencil tool, and I draw, I don't know, a squiggle. And that's a weird looking squiggle, right? Here, let's go back to the basic line. I can create text that follows that line. If you just click and hold on the text tool, it brings up other tools underneath it, other related tools. And there is one called Type on a Path tool. And what it allows you to do is select a path, and now you can start typing. Now you can start typing. Let me make that a little bigger so we can see it. Oh, that's still not big enough. You can see how the text follows the line, which is obviously a really fun tool. But what's really cool is that this is a vector object, so as you edit the vector, the text will follow along. And the same if you draw, say, a rectangle. And this is, I'll just leave it as that, but there is a type in an area tool, and you can select the rect. This text will follow the boundaries of the rectangle, so as you resize it, it will follow those boundaries. But you can also rotate, you can rotate the rectangle, and the text will follow that, okay? And you can also force it to be text that's at an angle, although that's a little riskier because it's hard to read. And you can see here that I can create an irregular shape, and the text will keep orienting itself to whatever I've created. Anyway, once you've created a board layout that you like, you can send that board into InDesign if you want, or you can just place some of your other drawings here in this board and just print directly from this one. So for example, I can bring in my Illustrator plan. When I bring it in, by the way, there are different artboards available. It will tell you, hey, you've got a couple of artboards, which one do you want? And you can bring those in separately. Okay, so here's my floor plan, and then I'll place the same plan, except now I'll choose the other artboard. And what's nice is that it's all one happy Illustrator family, so each of these will retain the information about the size of the drawing and whatnot. So you're ready to print this masterpiece, and like I mentioned, you can import the board into Adobe InDesign, but if you're just doing all of your board layout here, then you can actually just print this board. You don't need any further steps. The only trick is I would not print directly from Adobe Illustrator. I would create a PDF file instead. The way you do that, you go to File, Save As, and make sure you've saved your document at least once. And choose from the drop-down list of possible file formats, choose Adobe PDF, okay? And I'll click Save, and it will give us a couple of options for our PDF file. The big thing to worry about here, it will retain most other settings, but you can change the quality. Press quality is the highest quality PDF file. That will retain all sorts of information about colors and stuff like that. If the file is too big, you can choose one of these other ones, high quality print or smallest file size. That's especially important if you're emailing it to somebody for proofing. Anyway, then you just choose Save PDF, and now you have a file that you can email to yourself and take over to the printer. and have a nice print. And as with any printing operation, be sure you do a test print before, a test strip before printing the final version. So in summary, when you want to render a floor plan using Adobe Illustrator, the biggest thing is to have good preparation in AutoCAD and separate out a couple of different layers so that when you get to InDesign, they can be layered and configured properly and independently. And as a bonus, you can even do all of your layout right here in InDesign and print directly from the program if you choose to.